Good evening. I want to thank you all for resisting the temptation to go to the All About Beer seminar that I guess is down the hall. I'm Pete Peterson, the Executive Director of the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement at Pepperdine, and I'm very excited to be here tonight as we launch with the Trinity Forum a 2-year evening conversation series titled The Moral Sense in Politics and Policy with my good friend Bill McClay. At this point in my introduction, I usually like to say something witty about the hamlet from which I hail, Malibu, California. So in preparation, I Googled Malibu and meaning and was delivered this top hit. This is absolutely true. You can do it yourself. A definition from dictionary.com, Malibu, quote, is a resort on the Pacific coast of Southern California. Apparently, we don't even merit being a city. Suffice it to say, our town of 15,000 people is not known as one of the great intellectual centers of America. But at Pepperdine, we are doing our part to change that. And in particular, the School of Public Policy, now in its second decade, is educating today's and tomorrow's leaders in the civic and public sectors, two areas that deeply need it. And they're learning about factors outside of technocracy that are influencing policy and politics. The school was founded by men like Jack Kemp, Michael Novak, and James Q. Wilson. The latter moved to Malibu after completing a decade at UCLA. He went on to serve as our Ronald Reagan Professor of Public Policy for over a dozen years. Wilson helped develop the school's curriculum, uniquely based on a great books approach, with significant time devoted to the American founding, our Constitution, and what we call the roots of American order. Why has government been formed at all, wondered Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 15. Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason without restraint. But the founders knew that if government and laws were the only restrainers of men, you did not have a self-governing citizenry, but a mass of school children, or maybe worse. Beyond these external restraints, citizens in a republic need to display an inner capacity to not only abide laws, but to participate in the lives of their communities. In our day, no one has argued for, even quantified, the centrality of this moral sense more than James Q. Wilson, who we lost last year, and it is for his work that we title this lecture series. In his 1997 book, The Moral Sense, Wilson writes, and I quote, "Most of us have moral sense, but some of us have tried to talk ourselves out of it. It is if a person born to appreciate a golden sunset or a lovely song had persuaded himself and others that a greasy smear or a clanging gong ought to be enjoyed just as much as true beauty." In this technocratic era, we look forward to exploring this theme and this argument both tonight and in the years to come. So thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to Cherie Harder for the introduction of tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. I just wanted to add my own welcome to all of you for tonight's evening conversation on the persistence of guilt in a post-religious world, how it affects our public life, and what we can do about it. As Pete noted, this is the first in a 4-part series that we are partnering with the Pepperdine School of Public Policy on to try to provide a civil and thoughtful forum to discuss the often combustible mix of religion, politics, and morality. And we're also just particularly delighted that you are here. As with many of these evening conversations, we often run out of time for all the questions that are involved. So if you're here and you don't have a chance to ask your question, we are live blogging tonight's event, and you can follow along either on our Facebook page or by following us on Twitter. We'll also be video recording this event, so if there are folks you'd like to share this event with, you can get the link from our website. For those of you who are not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we exist to try to provide a space and resources for discussion of life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing reading and publications which draw upon the classic wisdom of the humanities and try to connect that wisdom, that timeless wisdom, with timely issues of the day, as well as by sponsoring programs such as the one tonight to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging life's biggest questions, and through it to come to better know the author of the answers. It's been said that the great questions of life essentially boil down to three. What is a good person? What is a good life? And what is the good society? And attempting to deal with any of these questions requires us to face up to guilt, real and imagined, individual and collective, denied and forgiven. And indeed, entire industries have sprung up to help us alleviate our guilty feelings, to set proper boundaries, to affirm our worthiness, to protect our self-esteem, and to debunk and dismiss those guilty feelings foisted upon us by Catholic schools, Jewish mothers, or religion in general. And yet, for all of this, our notions of guilt never seem to quite go away. In fact, our speaker tonight will argue that guilt has had a steadily intensifying, if often hidden, role in determining not only our individual choices, but our societal trajectory and the deep structure of our lives in modern times, even as the public influence of Orthodox faith declines. It's a provocative argument, and it's hard to imagine a more astute and insightful scholar to make it than Dr. Bill McClay. Bill is the SunTrust Chair of Excellence in the Humanities at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, where he's also a professor of history. He's taught at Georgetown University, Tulane University, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of Dallas. And he's currently a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson School, International Center for Scholars, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in DC, as well as at the Society of Scholars at the James Madison Program, and a member of the National Council of the National Humanities. He is also, I am very proud to say, a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. In addition to his extensive scholarship, Bill is a staggeringly prolific writer whose books include The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, which won the Merle Curti Award for Organization of American Historians for the best book of the year in American intellectual history, as well as The Student's Guide to U.S. History and Religion Returns to the Public Square. He also serves on the editorial boards of First Things, the Wilson Quarterly, the Public Interest, Society, Touchstone, Historically Speaking, and the University Bookman. And in addition to all of this, is a member of the Board of Governors of the American Historical Society. It is a great, perhaps even a guilty pleasure to welcome Dr. Bill McClay.
Well, Cherie did such a good job of summarizing my argument that I don't think I can match it. Thank you so much, and it is really wonderful to be here. I'm a great admirer of this organization, which I think Cherie has done a wonderful job in heading and augmenting and really causing to flourish. And I think it's an organization that deserves and needs your support and an active involvement wherever possible. So I commend it to you, and thank you for being here. This is what I'm going to be talking about tonight is sort of a work in progress. There's a book that will eventually come out of all this, and this is a small slice of it, although I think it's a fairly central slice. It is, in some ways, and with this audience, I think, say this, it has a little bit of an apologetic edge. I mean, in the sense of being an argument for faith. Although it's more of a negative argument, a negative theology in a way. You'll see what I mean when I get into it. And one other thing that makes this such a great subject is that everybody likes to talk about it. Since I decided to start working on this, I go places and give talks on various subjects that not necessarily related to this, and then go out to dinner with the people who've invited me, and they say, "What are you working on?" And I say, "A book about guilt." And at first they say, "Well, what a strange subject. And within 15 minutes, everybody at the table is engaged and they're trying to top one another with their stories of guilt. And Catholic mothers in Jewish schools, and not to mention what Cherie talked about. It's a subject of great personal interest to everyone, I think, and particularly people who have some degree of moral concern, which I hope includes all of us. It also has a public dimension, and that's, I think, important as a part of tonight's remarks in this venue, is to think about the way that guilt has become problematic and pervasive, not just for us as individuals, but for our society, for our public life. Let me start by just an anecdote. Always a good way to begin, something complicated and abstract. And I ask you to think back, and actually some of you may not even be aware that this happened. Several years ago, there was something in Great Britain called the Atheist Bus Campaign. Does anybody know about this atheist? But yeah. And Joe, I figured you would know. Well, and this was, as I understand it, Richard Dawkins, the uber atheist from Oxford, was offended by an advertising campaign launched by some evangelical group in Great Britain that was had on the sides of buses posters saying, religion is good, Jesus is all right with me, or whatever, something provocative like that. And he being easily provoked, thought there had to be a counter to this. And so he started this atheist bus campaign, and which consisted of posters on buses with the following saying: "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So this was the campaign. Needless to say, with a rather lame message, I'd have to say. I mean, I always thought Richard Dawkins was, if nothing else, a really great polemicist, but there's probably no God. I was talking to Cherie about this earlier. This is like the pilot of your plane coming on and saying, "We probably won't crash, so relax and enjoy your flight." But so it's a bit anemic. But the part that captured me was not so much there's probably no God part as the stop worrying part. And it struck me as a non sequitur. I mean, what does belief or non-belief in God have to do with whether or not one is worrying or failing to enjoy one's life? It didn't seem to me to follow logically, although clearly Dawkins and the people working on the Atheist Bus Campaign thought it did. So I thought about it, did some reading about it, and of course there is a lineage to this idea. And it goes back at least to Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's book on the genealogy of morality, or sometimes it's translated the genealogy of morals, argued that our very idea of God, or of the gods, originated hand in hand with the feeling of indebtedness. Those of you who know German will know that the word Schuld for guilt is the same word Schulden for debt. So guilt and debt are linked etymologically, and that arguably the same is true in English, although there's a lot of arguing. Philologists, they'll argue about anything. So, and I should mention here, before I go any further, that guilt obviously has at least two fundamental meanings. We can be referring to guilt as a forensic term, an objective term, one's culpability, you did it, and guilt as a subjective or emotional term, being guilty versus feeling guilty. These are analytically distinct, but it's very hard to separate them in fact. A lot of the time we spend trying to deal with our feelings of guilt revolve around trying to ascertain whether we are guilty. So, and that's just one of many examples of how they intertwine with one another. Of course, sometimes we feel guilty when there's no objective reason for it. So following this line of reasoning, Nietzsche goes on to say that this comes from this conflation of debt and guilt, comes from a dread of going back to the earliest tribal societies, a dread of the ancestor, the power of the ancestor, the sense that everything that one has is owed to one's ancestors. So this, I quote from Nietzsche here, the dread of the ancestor and his power, the consciousness of debts toward him increases in direct proportion to the increase in power of the tribe itself. In other words, as the tribe becomes more powerful, this sense of indebtedness to the predecessors becomes more powerful. And he goes on to say that the ancestor is finally transformed into a god. This is, he said, the actual origin of gods, an origin in fear. And then he goes on to say that this feeling of indebtedness towards a deity is something that grows over several millennia. How Nietzsche knows this is, another matter, but it's what he claims. Finally coming to and sort of culminating in Christianity, the advent of the Christian God as the maximal God yet achieved, thus brought about also the appearance of the greatest feeling of indebtedness on earth. And then he goes on to say, assuming that we have now, as the end of the 19th century, started in the reverse direction, we should be justified in deducing, with no little probability, that from the unstoppable decline in faith in the Christian God, there is even now a considerable decline in the consciousness of human debt. Indeed, the possibility cannot be rejected that the complete and definitive victory of atheism will release humanity from this whole feeling of being indebted towards its beginnings. Atheism and a sort of second innocence belong together. So guilt and indebtedness come together in the creation of gods, and thus the dissolution of the idea of these gods or of God, the Christian God, will also mean the lifting of those sense of debts and that sense of guilt. Well, I take it as assertion not needing much proof that this has not happened. Guilt has not disappeared at all from the landscape. I think a better prophet of the late 19th, early 20th century was Freud. Freud, of course, was no friend of religion, but he was, in his own grudging way, willing to give religion its due as he saw it. And in his great and gloomy book, Civilization and Its Discontents, he declared the following: that the tenacious sense of guilt is the most important problem in the development of civilization. In fact, he goes on, it seems the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. But guilt is an elusive quarry. It's hard to identify. It's hard to understand. It frequently goes underground, dwells on the unconscious level, and can easily be mistaken for something else. It often appears to us, so Freud argued, as a sort of malaise, a dissatisfaction for which people seek other explanations, external or internal. Guilt turns out to be crafty, a trickster, a shapeshifter, a chameleon, capable of disguising itself, hiding out, changing its size and appearance, even its location. And yet it manages to persist and deepen despite all these transformations. I believe that Freud, while mistaken in many other things that we won't need to discuss this evening, showed prophetic insight here in formulating this seeming paradox. By connecting the phenomena of rising guilt with the phenomenon of civilizational advance, he was pointing out an unsuspected but inevitable byproduct of progress itself, a byproduct that has proven to be chief among the enemies of progress. He was also posing a problem that will only become more pronounced in the generations to come, a problem for which his own invention of psychoanalysis was no solution, but remains an issue of unrelenting importance. If we're to sustain the idea of progress, which has fallen into disrepute in the postmodern intellectual dispensation, but is indispensable, we need to understand this connection more thoroughly than we have and understand how its negative effects can be counteracted. Hence, the goal of my study, of which this is a part, is a fuller understanding of the dynamics that ironically link progress and guilt, along with a tentative answer to the question of what can be done, if anything, about their ominous linkage. And I think the implications of this for public life and public policy, for our lives in community, are pretty obvious. Okay, so let me start rolling out some elements of this argument. First, think back to Freud again. We live in a therapeutic age, and nothing illustrates this, and thanks to Freud in many ways. And nothing illustrates this more clearly than the ways in which the sources of guilt's power and the nature of its would-be antidotes have changed for us. Freud sought to relieve his patients of an excessive, pathologically active, hyperactive conscience, while deliberately refraining from making judgments or imposing judgments upon them about whether the guilty feelings emanating from those consciences had any basis in moral fact. In other words, he sought to release his patients from guilt's moral weight by reducing or removing guilt's moral significance and redesignating it as just another psychological phenomenon. In a sense, he sought to demoralize guilt, to remove its moral implications, and treat it as simply as an objective, emotional, a subjective and emotional matter, not an objective matter. So health was the sole remaining criterion for success or failure in therapy. And health was a matter of managing a tolerable balance between all these competing elements in the psyche, you know, the id, superego, ego, and so on. Less a state of harmony than a kind of equilibrium of opposing forces. Americans are always very selective in the way we import things, particularly intellectual things. Freud was actually a very gloomy thinker, in many ways a very Victorian thinker. And his gloominess was unlikely to become a widespread popular taste in America. But his argument for the easing of Victorian sexual mores was an early vote getter, particularly among the advanced libidos of Greenwich Village. And the non-judgmental therapeutic worldview whose seeds he planted has clearly come to full flower in modern America, which in turn has affected the standing and meaning of the most venerable of moral transactions. Take, for example, the various ways in which forgiveness is now understood. Forgiveness is certainly one of the golden words of our language. It glistens with 100 admirable qualities. Its purity, its moral prestige seem beyond challenge. To forgive others is taken to be a sign of a full and munificent heart, a heart that wisely recognizes the fleeting nature of life and the universal weakness of all human beings, including oneself, very much including oneself. And yet forgiveness, rightly understood, doesn't deny the reality of justice. For to forgive, whether you're forgiving trespasses or debts, little in-joke for Protestants there, precisely means suspending all such just and legitimate claims in the name of the higher ground of love and human solidarity. That is why forgiveness is both costly and rare, rightly understood. However, scan the self-help shelves at the local bookstore and you'll find something very different. Lots of books on forgiveness with titles like Total Forgiveness, Forgiveness, How to Make Peace with Your Past and Get On with Your Life, Choosing Forgiveness, Your Journey to Freedom, and Forgiveness, the Greatest Healer of All. Dozens of websites, check them out, devote themselves to the subject, including my personal favorite, a website called Forgive for Good. It's hard to say fast, 5 times, Forgive for Good, by a man named Frederick Luskin, PhD. Whenever somebody has PhD after their name, watch out. Frederick Luskin, PhD, director and co-founder of the Stanford Forgiveness Project, and author of Forgive for Good, of course, a proven prescription for health and happiness. You know, so it's alliteration and internal rhyme. I mean, the guy's really got it going. And he says, Luskin says, forgiveness is for you and not for anyone else. I quote, that's a direct quote. I have more of Dr. Luskin coming, so that's, you know, he's so much fun. Even the very fine and well-respected journalist Greg Easterbrook wrote an article on the BeliefNet website called Forgiveness is Good for Your Health. Now look, I don't mean to disparage at all these writings in a wholesale way or label them utterly wrong. I think absolutely there's a lot to be said for any kind of act that can relieve people, can release the soul from captivity to poisonous, hateful, debilitating emotions. But the shift in emphasis is notable, is it not? In the new meaning, forgiveness is all about the forgiver and his or her well-being. And the motivation sometimes borders on the suspect. And you feel Dr. Luskin is about to enter this picture here. And as Dr. Luskin puts it, arguing for the health-giving benefits of forgiving, quote, remember that a life well lived is your best revenge. Forgiveness is about personal power. Okay. My point being that this is a different meaning. This is a new cast on this term, which is very different from the older idea that forgiveness means that the heart rises above the one that wounded it. In seeing forgiveness as a form of revenge and a locus of power, we've come a long way from Shakespeare's Portia in The Merchant of Venice, who memorably spoke of the quality of mercy, which droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven and blesses both him that gives and him that takes. We're a much longer way, and given the date in today's date in the Christian calendar, it's well to mention, we're a longer way from Christ's anguished cry from the cross, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And perhaps even further from the most basic sense of forgiveness, the canceling of a monetary debt or the pardoning of a criminal offense, in either case constituting a very conscious suspension of the rightful demands of justice. So, we still value forgiveness. In fact, we value it more than ever, but we're very confused about it. And in our confusion, we've produced a situation in which forgiveness, which of course is directly related to guilt, has in fact very nearly lost its weight as well as its meaning. Like similar acts of confession or apology, particularly when they're delivered in public, and other transactions in the moral economy of sin and guilt, forgiveness is in danger of being debased into a kind of cheap grace, a waiving of standards entirely, standards without which such transactions have no meaning. Again, to repeat, forgiveness only makes sense in the presence of a robust sense of justice. Without that, it is in real danger of being reduced to something passive, automatic, empty, a sanctimonious way of simply moving on. So there's a problem with the understanding of guilt and forgiveness in our day, a transformation of them into floating signifiers without any clear connection to the antecedents to which they once corresponded. As I've tried to establish, this state of affairs arises partly out of the therapeutic view that the experience of guilt doesn't involve any genuine moral issues, but rather just the interplay of psychic forces that don't relate to anything consequential, morally consequential. One might call this position an assertion of the fundamentally unreal nature of guilt, the unreality of guilt. And by the way, to a certain extent, the growing in popular acceptance notion that our behavior is primarily determined by biogenetic determinants over which we have no control actually accomplishes some of the same thing, making the notion of moral responsibility less and less easily applied. James Q. Wilson wrote a very wonderful essay. One of the last things he wrote was about the future of blame. Will it be possible for us to see people as responsible agents that can be blamed for their actions? And he was reflecting on that very thing, the increasing emphasis on deterministic biogenetic origins of human behavior. Okay, so the unreality of guilt. But that's not the only thing that confuses us. There's another factor at work. One that seems diametrically opposed. And I call it the infinite extensibility of guilt. You'll immediately grasp this, I think, but let me elucidate. It proceeds from a different set of assumptions, and surprisingly is a byproduct of modernity's proudest product, our ever-growing capacity to comprehend and control the physical world and the terms of our existence in it. In a world in which the web of relationships between causes and effects is ever better understood, in which the means of communication and transportation become ever more efficient and effective, in which individuals become ever more powerful and effective agents, the range of our potential moral responsibility under these circumstances, and therefore of our potential guilt, expands to literally infinite proportions. In an ever-shrinking, ever more interconnected world, to give you one example, it is theoretically possible for every living person to go anywhere that he or she wants to go, to be made literally or at least virtually present to any person in ways that promise to become ever more vivid and high definition in the future. In such a world where there are few intrinsic limits to what I can do, there's almost nothing for which I cannot be in some way held accountable. I can see a picture of a starving child in a remote corner of the world on my television and know for a fact that I could travel to that remote place and relieve that child's immediate suffering if I cared to. And the list goes on. Whatever donation I make to a worthy charitable organization, it's never as much as I could have given. Certainly, you've never given as much as you should have given to Trinity Forum. I just add that in. So, I can never diminish my carbon footprint enough. Certainly not enough to suit some people. Or give to the poor enough. Or support medical research enough. Or otherwise do the things that would render me morally blameless. And the list goes on. Colonialism, slavery, structural poverty, water pollution, deforestation. The demands on an active conscience are literally as endless as an active imagination's ability to conjure them. And those of us who teach young people often encounter this, and we often have occasion to observe that it was precisely the most morally sensitive individuals who have the weakest common sense defenses against such overwhelming assaults on their over-receptive sensibilities, assaults that often amount to little more than propagandizing and manipulation, particularly when questions of environmental sin are the ones at stake. So these two factors, the therapeutic or biologically determined unreality of guilt on the one hand, paired with the crushing hyperabundance of it, the infinite extensibility of guilt, these would seem to be completely diametrically opposed. How can something illusory be something omnipresent? Are we guilty of nothing or guilty of everything? But in practice, of course, the two tend to reinforce one another. The utter disproportionality of the second leads to its being managed by means of the first. Not knowing how to cope with the monumental scale of our infinitely extensible guilt, we dissolve it into a Woody Allen joke. But what cannot be laughed entirely out of existence is the tenacious sense of moral incompleteness, a sense of moral burden, a burden that I believe all of us, except perhaps the sociopathic, share to a greater or lesser extent. And as Freud knew, this sense can hide in the dark for a long time, moving the chess pieces around with an invisible hand. So excessive is our propensity for guilt, particularly in the developed nations of the Western world, that the French writer Pascal Bruckner, a name I absolutely love, he's obviously an Alsatian with Pascal Bruckner. Sorry, I couldn't resist. He wrote a book that some of you may know a couple of years ago called The Tyranny of Guilt. And in this book, Bruckner identified the problem as Western masochism. This is not Pepperdine Western. This is Western world Western. The lingering presence, he said, of the old notion of original sin, the ancient poison of damnation, is at fault. So even secular philosophers and sociologists fall captive to its logic. The more they proclaim themselves to be agnostic, atheists, and freethinkers, the more they take us back to the religious beliefs they are challenging. So as a consequence, and actually this is a kind of Nietzschean argument, we haven't gone far enough in extirpating these religious reflexes. Most Western thought, he says, a little more than a mechanical denunciation of the West in which remorse has ceased to be connected with historical circumstances and has instead become a dogma, a spiritual commodity, almost a form of currency, manifested in the non-stop duty of repentance. Nietzsche couldn't have said it better. But as much as I admire, and this is really a book well worth reading, it's wonderfully written, spirited, but so as much as I admire it, I think it's defective, seriously defective, because the problem, in my view, goes much deeper than a mere question of alleged cultural masochism arising out of our vestigial moral reflexes. Because it's not only our pathologies that point us in this direction. The pathologies themselves, to the extent that they are pathologies, they have an anterior source, if I'm right, in the very things of which we're most proud, our knowledge of the world, of its causes and effects, and our power to shape and alter those causes and effects. In short, the anterior cause is progress itself. Unless one takes the position that guilt is to be banished in toto from the human condition, a position that would be both silly and horrible, one has to face the fact that in a world of ever-growing knowledge, there is no honest, non-arbitrary way of deciding how much guilt is enough and how much is too much. Hence, the paradox that Freud identified. And with this paradox, we come to the heart of my argument, which is that notwithstanding all claims about, in some ways this parallels Bruckner, despite my differences with him, notwithstanding all claims about our living in a post-Christian world devoid of censorious public morality, I argue that in fact we live in a world that carries around an enormous and growing burden of guilt, and yearns to be free of it. This condition cannot be explained away as a psychological aberration, and it's not solely a product of religion. It is, to repeat, a product in large measure of the very things of which we in the modern West have been most proud, most understandably proud. Our achievements in the realm of science and technology, which have enabled us to exert an ever greater and greater mastery of the terms of our physical existence. Such achievements cannot help but create psychological burdens that are too little acknowledged and are forever looking for an opportunity to discharge themselves. Indeed, it's impossible, I think, to exaggerate how many of the deeds of individual women and men and groups, even outwardly vicious or violent or dehumanizing deeds, can be traced back to the powerful and inextinguishable need of human beings to feel themselves right with the world. Taking away God does not seem to have made this disappear. One would be right to expect that such a powerful need, as powerful as a physical need, would continue to find ways to manifest itself, even if it does in odd and perverse ways. For example, in the rise of the extraordinary prestige accorded to victims as a category in the contemporary world. This development itself is worthy of a lengthy exposition. How did victims come to be seen in such a positive way? It's certainly not something you would find in the ancient world, for example. And it certainly involves Christianity and perversions thereof. But I have to, I don't want to be here with you all night. I'll say only this, that this development of this category and the prestige accorded to it makes sense, because a victim is by definition a blameless person whose condition is the fault of others. That's what it means to be a victim. One who can claim victimhood has thereby been freed from the weight of guilt. It's a kind of expiation. And this brings me to a very curious story that I think is full of significance in these matters. This, again, is the kind of thing you cannot imagine happening, I don't believe, at any earlier time in human history. It comes from a New York Times op-ed column. Speaking of things you can't imagine in human history. But it's a very good column by Daniel Mendelsohn, a professor at Bard College, who wrote a book about his family's experience of the Holocaust, telling various stories related to that family's experiences. In the column, Mendelsohn talks about hearing the story of an orphaned Jewish girl who trekked 2,000 miles from Belgium to the Ukraine, survived the Warsaw Ghetto, murdered a German officer, took refuge in forests where she was protected by kindly wolves. This story was given wide circulation in a 1997 book, and its veracity was generally accepted. But then, at the time of this column, in 2008, it had been discovered to be a complete fabrication created by a Belgian Roman Catholic woman named Monique de Wael. This deception, Mendelsohn argued, is not an isolated event. It needs to be seen in the context of a growing number of what he calls phony memoirs, such as the notorious child survivor Holocaust memoir Fragments, or Love and Consequences, the putative autobiography of a young mixed-race woman raised by a black foster mother in gang-infested Los Angeles. These books were, Mendelsohn says, a plagiarism of other people's trauma. Wonderful phrase, a plagiarism of other people's trauma, written not as they claim to be by members of oppressed classes, the Jews during World War II, the impoverished African Americans of Los Angeles today, but, and I'm quoting Mendelsohn here, by members of relatively safe or privileged classes. Interestingly, too, he notes that the authors seem to have an unusual degree of identification with their subjects. In fact, a degree of identification approaching the pathological. Miss de Waal, for example, the Belgian woman, declared, after having been found out, rather astonishingly, that, quote, "The story is mine, not actually reality, but my reality, my way of surviving." Mendelssohn goes on to draw some very interesting conclusions from these stories about how we've lost a sense of reality, how we are taken in by the claims of empathy in our culture, and so on. With all due respect, I think he's missed the point, the deeper point of his own story. Or let me put it this way, that there are profounder inferences to be drawn from these strange phenomena. There have always been stories about what we call stolen valor, when people who try to inflate their standing with others by boasting of wartime exploits that never occurred. In the case of the historian Joseph Ellis a few years ago, very sort of sad example of that. It's not hard to understand the motive behind such fraudulence, the desire to be thought a hero and to be identified with heroic virtues. But this is different, the cases that Mendelssohn is citing. What these authors are appropriating is stolen suffering, not stolen valor. And the identification they're pursuing is an identification not with heroes, but with victims. It is a peculiar and particular kind of identity theft. How to account for it? What is motivating it? Why would comfortable, privileged people want to identify with victims? And why would their efforts appeal to a substantial reading public? Or to pose the question even more generally in a way that I think goes straight to the heart of our dilemma, how can one account for the rise of the extraordinary prestige of victims as a category in the contemporary world? And my answer is that the explanation is traceable back to the extraordinary weight of guilt in our time, pervasive need to find innocence through some kind of moral absolution, to discharge one's moral burden somehow, and the fact that the conventional means of finding that absolution or keeping the range of one's responsibility for one's sins within some kind of reasonable boundaries are no longer available. Making a claim to the status of certified victim or identification with victims offers itself as a substitute means by which the moral burden of sin can be shifted and one's innocence affirmed. Recognition of this substitution may operate with particular strength in certain individuals, such as these authors. But the strangeness of the phenomenon suggests a larger sense of sensibility, which represents a change, perhaps, in the moral economy of sin and guilt in our time. And almost none of this has occurred consciously. So where does that leave us? The progress of our scientific and technological knowledge in the West and the culture of mastery that have come along with it has worked to displace the cultural centrality of Christianity and Judaism, the great historical religions of the West. But it has not been able to replace them, certainly not completely. For all of its achievements, modern science has left us with at least two overwhelmingly important and insoluble problems for the conduct of human life. Actually, the three questions that Cherie answered, science doesn't have an answer to any of the three, but my questions are a little different. First, modern science cannot instruct us in how to live, since it cannot provide us with the ordering ends according to which our human strivings should be oriented. In a word, it cannot tell us what we should live for, let alone what we should be willing to sacrifice for or die for. Having prescinded from teleology in its means, it has to do so in its ends too, it being science. And second, science cannot do anything aside from pharmacological interventions to relieve the weight of guilt on our souls, a weight to which it has added appreciably, precisely by rendering us able to be in control of and therefore accountable for more and more elements in our lives, responsibility being the seedbed of guilt. That growing weight seeks opportunities for release, seeks outlets, but finds no obvious or straightforward ones in the secular dispensation. Instead, more often than not, we're left to flail about, seeking some semblance of order in an incoherent post-Christian moral economy that lacks the transactional power of absolution or expiation, without which no moral system can be bearable. So, what is to be done? I wish I knew. But one conclusion seems to be unavoidable, and I think this does have implications for our public life. Those who view the obliteration of religion, and particularly of Judeo-Christian metaphysics, as the modern age's great and signal act of human liberation, read Richard Dawkins, need to reconsider their dogmatism on that subject. The decline of God has not put an end to our worrying, despite the bumper sticker slogan of the atheist bus campaign. In other words, the persistent problem of guilt may open up an entirely different basis. This is my little apologetic coda. It may have opened up an entirely different basis for considering the claims of religion. If I'm correct, then human progress cannot be sustained without religion or something like it, whatever that might be, and specifically without something like the very moral economy of sin and absolution that has hitherto been vouchsafed by Christianity, by the religious traditions of the West. Such an argument, if one were to make it, would not be based in theological apologetic terms, but in empirical realities regarding the social and psychological makeup of advanced Western societies. Without the support of religious beliefs and institutions, one may have no choice but to accept the dismal prospect envisioned by Freud, in which the advance of human civilization brings not happiness, but an ever-mounting tide of unassuageable guilt, ever in search of novel and ineffective ways to discharge itself. Such a prospect may steadily diminish the human prospect and is therefore not sustainable. It may smother the energies of innovation that have made the West what it is and undermine the very possibility of progress itself. It must therefore be countered, but if it is to be countered, it must first be understood. And I hope that I've made a little bit of a down payment in that direction. Thank you very much. And I think we're open to a discussion, which can be quite freewheeling, right? If you want to give a speech, there is a microphone, yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm not a theologian, but I'd like to sort of pose a question from a theological point of view. What about the devil, Lucifer, the accuser, and the creation of the sense of guilt, and maybe our shortfalling from the law and the attempts to try and live up to the law as opposed to the types of things that Paul talks about in Romans?
Well, you know, I think that's a big question, and what about the devil? Even John Milton couldn't quite figure that out. I mean, all know the story about Blake saying that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it in Paradise Lost, but because he is in parts of the poem a very attractive figure, actually, very human figure in a way that none of the heavenly figures are, but I'm being a little facetious with you. I clearly, part of the role, and I'm speaking of this psychologically, this is a psychological argument in a way, it's not a theological one. The devil, leaving aside, C.G. Jung and people who kind of skirted in disturbing ways on the edges of this. The devil is a kind of personification of evil, and within, I guess you do have to get into theology in a little bit with this, in the sense that the one way of understanding our earthly existence is within Christian theology is that we are kind of living in the aftermath of a great heavenly quarrel, and understanding the nature of that quarrel would be, part of understanding your place in the cosmic scheme of things. But I just looking at it psychologically, the devil is a tempter, as in some ways the a source of evil thoughts, evil deeds. Both gives us a target onto which we can displace some of our anxieties about these things, and also someone to blame. He plays a role in letting us off the hook a little bit, not necessarily individually, but in a larger scheme of things. So I think, and I'm not sure I am understanding the thrust of your question or doing justice to it, but I think the loss of the devil, the loss of the idea of evil, more generally, in so much even Christian theology, has, I think, implications for this argument, because it makes it very difficult to explain a lot of things. It makes it difficult to find the means to redress the debts that sin creates. This isn't quite on the subject of the devil, but I think this is related. Our whole notion of punishment, the way that we think of the penal system, we're very uncomfortable with the idea that retribution should be a part of what we punish people for. And yet, without that notion, which, by the way, is reflected in the notion that a criminal who goes to jail pays his debt to society. There's that conflation of sin and debt right there. Without that notion, it's less clear what we actually are trying to do, and whether in some ways the notion of rehabilitating a human being is not a greater infringement on their dignity than simply punishing them, enacting society's just retribution against him for his actions. So I think the removal of the devil from the picture is a part of that whole evacuation of a kind of calculus, of a moral calculus that renders these things intelligible, and therefore susceptible of being atoned for. That's one of the things we've lost, is sin, guilt piles up, but we've lost the metaphysical framework within which there's any intelligible way that those things could be discharged. At least that's my argument.
Like to be a devil's advocate. And Bill, let me say I have my own answer to this question, so it is a rhetorical question, okay?
It
in
is
in my mind. But let's just say that you know, with Hollywood and so on, you see so many crosses, everybody's wearing them, right? Okay.
Okay.
We're talking about guilt, right? So Jesus did two things. This is my rhetorical statement that I would like you to comment on. He called everyone to be perfect, which we can't be. Okay, that's number one. And number two, he suffered greatly. And so if we're not following that example, we feel guilty as well.
Well, of course, you're leaving out other things that he did. Yeah, you're leaving out what you're sort of ending the story with somewhere in the middle of Good Friday. I mean, you haven't even had him die, if I heard you right, let alone be raised from the dead. Well, I mean, my point is that when we say that as it commonly say, Jesus died for your sins. Jesus died for the sins of the world. Jesus took the sins of the world upon himself. I mean, this is a kind of expansion of the whole notion of the scapegoat, the Paschal Lamb that takes on the sins of the community. It is a way that connects with older Jewish notions of how sin is paid. But the fundamental idea is that sin must be paid. That's why I emphasize the connection with debt. Debt must be paid. It cannot simply, you can't take Prozac and have it go away. It has to be paid in some way. That's an essential part of the transaction involved in what I call the moral economy of sin. And that's why I objected to your two things. I think there need to be a few more other things that Jesus did included in your list. So I hope I... Keep going. Okay.
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking lecture, so I have a few different questions in whichever one might strike you.
I'll take the easy one.
So you kind of spoke against a strict biological determinism, but especially in thinking of this as a polemic to others who might not be believers, would you give credence to saying that guilt is something that, like, kind of in thinking of a group theory of human evolution, that we have reciprocal altruism that helped within certain groups of humans thrive throughout evolutionary history, that guilt is something that, aside from religion, is a beneficial experience. That when humans experience guilt, that we are better at resolving conflict and ultimately building trust, and that's outside of any religious confines, something that's just...
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That was simple.
Well, then, just one other quick piece then.
I mean, part of what I find to be wanting, both in Dawkins's analysis, in Nietzsche's analysis, and in Pascal Bruckner's, I wouldn't love to say that name, analysis, is that you don't have to have religion to have guilt. I think that's precisely where they're wrong. Why the Atheist Bus campaign is wrong.
You don't need religion to show the benefit of guilt and then resolving it.
Yeah, all of that. Yes.
And then one other piece, within looking at Genesis 1 and 2, as a precursor to any discussions of guilt or forgiveness, seems to be a description or a phenomenology of shame, in which Adam and Eve experience God seeing them and realizing they are naked. Can you say anything to the connection or the relationship between guilt and shame?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, the conventional sort of anthropological distinction is that shame is external. Shame stems from the disapproving view of the community, and guilt is internalized. The guilt is in some sense a more modern, more individualistic affect. And I think that actually, in practice, the distinction tends to break down. I think it's more analytically useful it's more analytically useful than it is in empirically useful, because in fact I think in most cases of guilt you have incidents of shame that precede them and that condition them. I mean, Freud, I hate to keep coming back to Freud, who I don't even really buy, but he's so useful in this, that the whole notion that the superego is the introjection of the parent. That's a way in which an external sanction becomes made internal. So there is a connection between the two, and I think analytically you can separate them, but in practice they often tend to go together.
So, hi, that was wonderful. I have a question. I have a suggestion for what I guess would be maybe chapter 6 or 7 in the book.
Oh, please. Yes.
And the framing question, the chapter is guilt and social media. And the question is, if you were to look at some of the reports in the paper or your favorite news outlet, at what people are seemingly guiltlessly confessing in their tweets or their Facebook postings or whatever, you could be forgiven for concluding that guilt is dead. And there seems to, and so the question is social media kind of a technologic form of confession, and people really have guilt and they're getting rid of it that way? Or are we just hearing from the sociopaths and psychopaths who have a way of putting it out there?
I'm not the best person to answer this question because, as several of my friends in the audience know, I sort of have resolutely stayed away from social media. But I know I have children. You know, I know what goes on to some extent. And what I would say is that this is an analog to the sort of Frederick Luskin view of forgiveness. That a confession offered, semi-anonymously, certainly not to the person face to face whom you've injured. Or to a priest, to someone in authority, who's not only whose opinion of you matters, but whose judgment of you matters. This is a much cheaper thing, I would say, and it may be a kind of parody of the real thing rather than being a. Plus, I think this may be a place where the shame-guilt distinction is helpful because there is. You have to explain why people want to make the confession. And they want to do it in an environment in which they're likely not to be shamed, right? I mean, they're not. This is not a risky proposition to say, well, I lusted after my neighbor's wife or something like that, and people, oh, that's fine, that's okay, everybody does that, But there's some kind of guilt that is the impetus behind you wanting to make that confession, even if you do it in a completely safe environment in which you'll get all the affirmation that you want. It's a kind of empty ritual to me, but then maybe I don't understand what's really going on. And today, another way of thinking, thinking about guilt and shame. Another way. This is actually more related to your question, which I'm still thinking about, but I think of the example, something I actually did. One time I was arriving at the airport to catch an early flight. I was late, and I pulled into a parking place and nicked, more than nicked, the car next to me. And I was in such a hurry that No, it's not okay. I didn't write a note. I didn't explain anything. It was pretty obvious who had done it because I was there parking, and I probably had some of his paint on my car or her paint. And that has bothered me ever since. It was probably 10 years ago. That why didn't I leave a note? Why didn't I do the right thing? And there's been nobody shaming me about it. Nobody until this moment, other than me. I haven't even told my wife about this. But I think it's a great example of the difference between guilt and shame. And shame has not, now I may after this be ashamed of having said this, but it was guilt, not shame, that provoked me to want to get this out for some reason. I really don't understand. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. And
yeah,
this is a preview.
I just take on faith that you're out there.
I am. And if this is a preview of what your book's going to be about, I'm looking forward to your book and you coming back. It sounds great. My question is about the victimhood, and I hope you feel better right now after getting.
No, not really.
All right. It seems, if I heard you correctly, that there's people want to be identified as victims, and they feel as though that will relieve, if they're victims, that will relieve them of some guilt. I'm curious about the other side of it, sort of, particularly criminal prosecutors identifying with the victims and really not being prosecutors on behalf of the public at large, but really being sort of the avengers on behalf of the victims and speaking to the victims a great deal and asking them what is their feeling on the crime that was done. I appreciate it, I'm empathetic, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. And that's the substance of my question.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've known some district attorneys and probably public prosecutors in my time, and they run the gamut. But I have known a few who were clearly channeling all kinds of other emotions in the sort of crusading zeal with which they went after those whom they could prosecute. And it, this borders on a kind of psycho-slander for me to go much further down that road, because I mean, I don't know these people, I don't know what's going on in their mind, but I do think that there's, I hope this is not too evasive an answer, but I think there's definitely the potential for that. At the same time, I think great many people, and most of the people I know who do that kind of work, I mean, face it, they're not as well paid as the attorneys for the defense, who are often defending scoundrels, and they go into a life of public service that when they could have done other more remunerative things. And a lot of the ones I know are actuated by a very high sense of justice. So I don't want this, my statement to be taken as saying, oh, they're all a bunch of lunatics who are kind of working out their frustrations on the criminal element in our society. But there may well be some cases of that. Does that get to what you were asking? Well, of course, that's why there are other people, and you have to take into account that it's an adversarial system, so that attorneys assume that they're going to be countered by sort of people of equivalent power and force and rhetorical momentum. So that's how the system works. It doesn't work by having a prosecutor say, well, I'll be the judge here. No, what they do is they put forward their case as strongly as they can. We have a few attorneys here in the audience who I think will stick up for me on this. I hope they do. So it can be just as much of a violation of the system if one tries to play more than what is one's appointed role in it. Just in that context, that legal context. Now, that's to use a slightly different example. That is not to say, as I think a senator of no particular political party, I can't even remember which party it is, so said something the other day to the effect, well, I don't know whether this bill that we're going to pass is constitutional or not. That's up to the Supreme Court to decide. That seems to me is wrong to simply say, we have no concern with the constitutionality, because in fact they take an oath to uphold the Constitution too. So, this adversarial countervailing forces model only goes so far. I mean, we all have to have a sense of justice, of fealty to the Constitution, and so on in common, or else we're lost. Oh dear. Did I get that right, Counselor?
You got it exactly.
Okay, thank you.
You gave us your yin and your yang, your cult of the therapeutic and your cult of mastery. I was wondering if you could comment on another wrinkle. I know it's a wrinkle that you'll recognize, as a kind of Nisbetian phenomenon, which suggests that as more and more aspects of our day-to-day lives become under the sway and influence of large, massive institutions, of national and transnational forces, our sense of agency shrinks. And with that comes perhaps a loss of sense of culpability and of responsibility and of guilt.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, that is another wrinkle. That's another turn of the paradox that that what can sometimes seem like mastery can seem like the most utter helplessness. I can drive a car anywhere I want to go. I have to have a car to do anything at all in this society. I mean, what's the mastery? What's the helplessness? I mean, that's not really dealing with the example of large corporations, but I think it's transferable to that. I think that's right, and I think all I can say for now. I mean, this is definitely something I've thought about and I'm working on, but I think it's part of the conundrum of fixing blame, of finding responsibility that is manageable, that has a human scale to it, that is tailored to the size of our own hands and of our own bodies and deeds and the context, the immediate context within which we work. He mentioned Robert Nisbet. That's what the Nisbetian was. That's the great sociologist who wrote, among other works, the wonderful 1953 book, The Quest for Community. And Nisbet made an argument similar to what Mr. Andrews has made about the ways in which the dominance of large entities, particularly governments, the expansion of the state has rendered local communities more and more fragile, more and more emptied of their basic function, one of which is something that can't be done in larger entities, and that is the inculcation of the moral sense. I mean, that's part of what we're gathered here to talk about, is politics and public life and the moral sense. And yet it does seem to me that one of the things that we have to, that I think this question brings out very well, is that the place where the moral sense is inculcated ultimately is in families, in small communities, in churches, in what we call civil society, not by the national government, not by the mayor of New York, for God's sake. It's almost a category error to think that you can use government, particularly on a large scale, to do that kind of thing. You might be able to use government on a smaller scale. The mayor of a small town like the town I live in can do that sort of thing and maybe have an effect. Although I don't think he's going to ban big gulps anytime soon. Anyway, that's a great point, a great question. That you know, in some ways, part of the problem with guilt, which relates to both sides of the conundrum, the emptying of the concept and the extension of the concept, is that both of them rob us of, as I call a non-arbitrary, finite sense of what our duties are and what our duties are not. And I think the loss of the smaller communities, the smaller context of social and cultural life, is another way that we're kind of set adrift on this sea of guilt. So it will be chapter 7 after your chapter. Thank you all very much. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was fabulous. I really can't imagine a better speaker to kick off our 4-part series, The Moral Sense in Politics and Policy. I also just want to particularly thank our partners in this effort, Pepperdine University and the School of Public Policy, especially Pete Peterson for his leadership in this. It's really been a joy and a delight working with you. We're also delighted to have Ashley Trim and Rich Gathro here from Pepperdine, as well as several students, and we're just delighted you could come here. I'd also just like to acknowledge a few of our trustees. Our past chairman of the board, Al Sykes, is here with Marty, as well as Kathy Wills-Wright, and some of the folks from the Trinity Forum Academy, so we're delighted to have you. If you'd like to pass along this event to friends, acquaintances, colleagues, clients, we will have the link on our website, probably on Pepperdine's as well, and encourage you to pass along that link. We'll also have photographs from this event on our Facebook page, so if you've not yet joined us on Facebook, please do so. Tag your friends and the like. I also just want to announce our next event, which will be a little over a month from now. On May 1st, we'll be having our next meeting of the Trinity Forum DC Reading and Discussion Group, where we'll be discussing our latest work, To Tell the Truth to Kings. And I'm delighted to announce that the introduction author, John O'Quick, is actually with us here tonight and will be coming down from Boston to lead that discussion group on May 1st. So any of you who are interested, we really encourage you to come. That is part of an ongoing effort where invitations are extended to all members of the Trinity Forum Society, and hopefully all of you have on your chair an invitation to join. And this is something we would really commend to you as an opportunity. It's the members of the Trinity Forum Society that help us put on programs such as these, help us publish our different readings. Many of you probably saw them next door, and basically enable us to fulfill our mission to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. So we would invite you to join us in that mission. We think it's an important one, an exciting one, and we really can't do it without you. So hope that you'll join us. Finally, I'd just like to acknowledge some of my fantastic team members on Trinity Forum staff, Lucy Lafitte, Margaret Eberly, Chloe Cuffle, and Michelle Loomis, who have been very busy registering everybody, photographing folks, sending around the microphone and the like. Please give them your regards as well. And with that, thanks for coming, and the bar is open.